Hey folks, David Stewart here. Hope you guys are having a fantastic day. Let's do a little bit more storycraft today. We're going to talk about antagonists, specifically villains, and most specifically sympathetic villains. Do you need to have your villain be sympathetic? Does your story need to have the villain be understandable to the audience some way, to have motivations which the audience understands or identifies with or even approves of? Well, the short answer, of course, is no. There's always exceptions, but for most stories, this actually will undercut what you're trying to do in the story because you want the protagonist's goal to be the goal that the audience wants to succeed and to be in doubt of. You don't want the audience to be conflicted about who should succeed or who shouldn't. Obviously, there's exceptions, but most people are writing a story about a hero trying to achieve a goal, and the antagonist is the one stopping the hero from achieving that goal. The more unlikable the antagonist happens to be, the more, the better feelings we have towards the hero actually accomplishing his goals and overcoming the challenges in the story. So the reason this comes up is that someone, I think it was just a YouTube thumbnail maybe, or maybe just a YouTube video screenshot of it. There was a YouTuber who came out with a video that's like, this big subversion of expectations with the Jack Horner villain in the new Puss in Boots movie, who is just an evil character. He's a fully evil character. He does evil things all the way through. This is not really a subversion of normal storytelling tropes at all. The only thing that might be remotely subversive is the jokes that they make about the fact that the villain is not sympathetic at all. He goes on a very slight little monologue where he says, I was raised in an intact home, given a business. He has no reason to be as evil as he is. He just is evil. And he's actually a really good example of an antagonist or a villain, according to the way that I think is good to write villains. But before I get to that, and I'll tell you those, this has been a trend. They're making fun of a trend that has existed in Hollywood for several years now of attempting to make antagonists have motivations that the audience likes or at least understands. And some of these have actually been disturbing. So one of them was Thanos from the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So the first two Infinity War, the only two Infinity War movies, but the first one in particular, he's going to eliminate half of the population of the universe so that people are not living in poverty. It's a Malthusian motivation. Of course, Malthus was an idiot. Thomas Robert Malthus. His theory is complete bunk. And the motivation is silly, but what was disturbing is the number of people that found this motivation to be virtuous, which really means that we've been so heavily propagandized by misanthropic environmentalism over the last few decades that people actually thought the villain trying to kill half the people in the universe was a sympathetic villain, that his insane motivations, and really in the comics, he just wants to impress death. It's a much more chaotic set of motivations. They gave him some kind of reason to do it, and that actually undercuts him as a villain and made him sympathetic to some people's eyes, which I think undoes. I think it hurt the story, frankly. So I think it hurt the story, and it was really disturbing the number of people that actually attach themselves to this. It goes further back to, you have movies like Maleficent, which attempt to, rehabilitate a fae demon. Maleficent is a fairy. She's of the fae. It's just like a demonic area. She's evil. There's nothing good about her. She's like a fallen angel. She's a demon. So you don't really need to have some kind of backstory about how she's angry at the king because the king did something bad to her. And even then, you're really just kicking the can like one generation down the road. She's bad because the king was bad to her. Well, the king was bad to her because his mom was bad to him, or something like this. All of this comes from a modern therapeutic ideal, which can mean many things. But in this case, what I mean by that is that there's this belief coming from, at this point, over 100 years of tradition with psychology, that people who do bad things because bad things have happened to them. Either they were traumatized as children, or someone else did something evil to them. Really, they come from a bad circumstance, and that's where their villainy arises from. So if they're doing something bad, they should be a little bit sympathized with, because it's not completely their fault. They come from a bad place. They had a bad upbringing. They suffered some sort of bad fate in the past, which caused them to be a villain. Now, this is not something that's completely untrue in the real world, but we're talking about stories here. And the point of a story is to tell a story about a protagonist. In most stories, not every story has to fit these boxes, but we're talking about most people want to tell a story about a hero succeeding in his quest or whatever. So, yeah, in that case, you don't need a villain who's got some sort of long-standing reason, some sort of broken psychological reason for being bad. You just need someone who's going to stand in opposition to the protagonist and who you want to fail, as you want the protagonist to succeed. So anyway, I think that's where most of this comes from, is this, I guess, this therapeutic ideal, this belief that people are not really responsible for the way they are, that they are a product of things that have happened to them. This kind of takes a, not so much a free will approach to the way things are, but I think it's really just incorporating psychological ideas from the real world into story writing. And I think in most cases it produces a weaker story throughout. There's lots of different villains that I've seen pop up like this, especially, say, in the MCU. The number of people who thought Killmonger was supposed to be a sympathetic villain was really kind of funny to me as well, because he is really like Black Hitler. Like, he has a life, a downtrodden life. Hitler wrote a whole book called, My Struggle, and then he wanted to have his race be supreme over the world and rule over all of the races, and didn't care how he did that, and was willing to subvert the political process to get it done. He's basically Black Hitler, and the sympathy there is that really that the character's supposed to be like, well, maybe we should be thinking about our racial brothers and sisters outside of our own country. That was, that's the depth of the moral quandary there. Not like Killmonger's actually a good guy. No, he's really a bad guy. But it kind of undercuts the entire story, the fact that we stop and think like maybe Killmonger was right somehow. It's like, no, we don't want him to be right. We want him to fail because he's evil, and we want the good guy to win because he's good. This is the way a superhero story really works. You can have complex villains, but if you try to make them too sympathetic, it starts to undo the fabric of the story. And I didn't think it was particularly bad in Black Panther. I just thought it was funny how many people took those origin scenes and kind of ran with them and turned Killmonger into this like sympathetic kind of anti-villain sort of character, which I didn't get, and I don't think you should either. But maybe those decisions actually did undercut the story. So how do you make a villain that is really a villain? Well, the thing is that you don't need a villain to have some sort of crazy backstory to be evil. All of us do things that we regret. We all sin. We do things that are not right sometimes. None of us thinks of ourselves as a villain, but we can identify the things we did and the motivations that caused them as maybe villainous things in that little isolated area when we do something bad. So if you want to make a villain that's really compelling as a villain, you don't have to give him a tragic backstory. Think of the 7 deadly sins. This is a really easy way to make a villain and create great motivations for a villain without having to dig into some sort of corrupt childhood that makes him all broken and psychotic. So the 7 deadly sins, you have pride, greed, wrath, lust, envy, gluttony, and sloth, which is laziness. So a villain will just have a really strong excess of one or more of those. You think of a Bond villain is motivated by greed, maybe, right? So what's greed? Greed is wanting more than what is due to you. So you're willing to steal to get something. That is greed. That's really easy. We've all lusted for items. We've all wanted something and been greedy about money or greedy about an object that we desired. So a really easy motivation for a villain is greed. They just want money. They want more stuff. A really good one is lust. Lust is something that can strike anyone, no matter how good their upbringing was. They could have been brought up in the best home. They can still experience lust, and they can still experience lust to the point where they would step over the line and do something villainous in order to satisfy their lust. And I think that makes a really compelling and evil villain. I think feelings of lust, particularly if you can make the villain rather physically unattractive, just really heighten the depth of evil. So they can, try to kidnap the girl or harm the hero in order to gain access to the thing that they lust after. We have, rightfully so, a strong disdain for things like sex offenders. And so if you make your villain a sex offender, he is going to be really evil, and you don't need some sort of tragic backstory about how he was an abused kid to explain how that doesn't excuse or explain any kind of child abuse that he might, or any kind of sexual abuse that he might be engaging in, right? We wouldn't accept that from a normal person, so we don't accept it from a villain. It's a great villainous trait, is to make him lust after something, lust after other people in a way. Gluttony, of course, is eating too much or just really engaging in too much pleasures of the body. Think of Baron Harkonnen from Dune. He's an excellent villain because he exhibits multiple deadly sins and just fully embraces them. He's completely evil. We don't need a big backstory about how he was abused as a kid or something like that to arrive at the point. The point is that he's evil, and he's opposed to Paul, and he's opposed to the Atreides. That's what really matters for the Baron Harkonnen character. And we have physical traits that point to those deadly sins. Gluttony. He's so fat he has to have like robots carry him around. In the books, at least, he has all these internal monologues where he's lusting after his own nephew and like viewing him in a sexual way as this beautiful kind of person. Sloth is just laziness. So we don't usually think of an antagonist as being lazy because he has to be active somehow. But we can have, bad people be lazy. They do bad things because they're lazy. They don't want to do the hard work. Envy, they're jealous. You're jealous of the protagonist. Anyone can be jealous. So these are things that can afflict anyone, and you can put them in your story. If you have a teen story, envy's a great one. This person's jealous of the protagonist. She does things that undercut the protagonist's desire. And then, of course, pride is like, I don't want anyone to get my championship belt. I'm not going to let this upstart boxer take my belt away from me. There's a pride that's associated with that antagonism. So that's the way to write a great villain, and you don't need some sort of long, complicated backstory that explains why they are the way they are. It's simply them giving into the normal sinful desires that we all have, but they give into them in a more profound way than we would think a normal person would give into. So that's the way that you write a really good villain. And you don't have to have a tragic backstory. And in fact, the more tragic the backstory is, the more sympathetic the villain becomes. The more you can undercut your story. One that I talked about, I guess, years ago at this point was The Grinch, this one starring Jim Carrey. You have all these flashbacks where he's being mistreated as a child by the Who's. You have this weird little green kid in the classroom with the ugly looking Who's with their strange facial prostheses. And the whole point, I guess, is to get you a little bit more on the Grinch's side. But that actually makes the Grinch's redemption much different than would have been in the book. When he's just a bad guy and the Who's are good, him turning around and deciding to do something good for the Who's is like a more redemptive thing. It's him repenting and turning away from his wickedness. Whereas when he repents and turns away from his wickedness in the movie, it's like, well, the Who's kind of deserve not to have Christmas. What is he doing here? Like, he's actually not in the wrong by stealing Christmas because they deserve to have it stolen from them. They're bad people. So making the Grinch sympathetic really hurt the story overall, and it confused you as to who the protagonist was. Was the Grinch the protagonist? I guess he was kind of the protagonist. He was doing all the pro-tagging. No one was really, the Who's were trying to stop him maybe, but they were really just antagonizing him. The Grinch was the good guy, and he should have just stolen all of the Christmas presents and rode off into the sunset and punished the Who's because they deserved it. Anyway, that's the sense that you get from having this tragic backstory for the Grinch monster of all things. You can see that taking tragic backstory, sometimes it works, but you don't have to have it, and it can hurt your story if you're not careful with how you're going to do it. Where I think it works out well is if you have a much more morally gray story to begin with. There's no real good guy or bad guy. There's two sort of morally conflicted characters facing off against each other. Maybe even something like Heat, where you have a contest between two different kinds of moral systems. Neither person is like a great person, but they're achieving their goals. They're trying to achieve their goals in a very relentless fashion. Something like The Godfather, like these mafia stories. Are the protagonists good guys? No, they're really anti-heroes, and so therefore you can have sympathy for their opponents and for them as well, depending on how you want to do it. That's where I think those things tend to work out a little bit better. Or in a movie like The Fugitive, where you have, I guess, an anti-villain sort of character. The antagonist is really a good character. He does want to catch the bad guy, but he cares more about the truth than he cares about just doing his job and catching the bad guy. He's an antagonist in the functional sense that he's opposed to the main character, the doctor. Oh my gosh, I'm spacing on his name. But the marshal is opposed to the fugitive, and the fugitive, of course, is the protagonist. The marshal is the antagonist, but he's not a bad guy. We sympathize with him a lot. He's wanting to do his job. He's wanting to catch a criminal, but he also cares about the truth, which makes him not really a bad guy. He's merely the antagonist in a story. So anyway, those are all things for you to think about. Give me your thoughts down below. Do you need a sympathetic antagonist? My answer would be no, and in fact, you probably shouldn't do it in most cases. It's definitely been a trope in Hollywood over the last few years, and that's what the joke in Puss in Boots: The Last Wish happened to be about. There's really no reason to have villains be particularly sympathetic. That's nothing out of the ordinary to have a villain just be evil because he happens to embrace some part of his some vice of his, one of the deadly sins. So let me know what you think down below, and I'll talk to you all next time. Newest books are All Shafalda, which is a fantasy tragedy, and of course Afterglow Generation Y, my latest collection of stories. I will have more books coming out here in 2023, so stay posted. Make sure you're on my list, dbspress.com/list. I will be giving away a free horror story very soon, so hop on there, and I will see you all next time. Have a great one.